The first time I realized 46 luxury homes had been flushing their sewage beneath my soybean field, I was driving a planter and drinking coffee that had gone cold 2 hours earlier. The monitor flashed a resistance spike, then another one exactly 50 feet later, straight as a surveyor's string. I shut the engine down, climbed into the dirt, and by sunset I knew somebody on the ridge had been using my family's land for 17 years without telling me. My name is Caleb Mercer, I'm 58, and I run 900 acres outside Millstone, West Virginia. Most of the ground my grandfather bought after coming home from Korea with one good knee and a bad habit of trusting handshakes. I studied civil engineering, spent 15 years designing drainage systems around Pittsburgh, then came home when my father got sick and never left again. My wife, Nora, runs a farm store by the highway. My son handles our cattle, and my mother still lives in the white farmhouse beside the lower pasture. Above us sat Hawthorne Crest, 46 stone houses, private tennis courts, a wine room in the clubhouse, and annual dues high enough to buy a decent used tractor. Their board president, Vivian Cross, had spent 3 years sending me certified letters about dust, rooster noise, fertilizer smell, and what she called the visual disorder of farm equipment. I answered everyone politely. I even sent her an old photograph showing the same barn, the same lane, and roughly the same amount of mud. She never acknowledged it. So when I found that buried line, I called my daughter Elise, an environmental engineer for the state. I sent her the GPS coordinates and a scan from the planter. 40 minutes later, she called back and said, "Dad, that is not irrigation. That is the main sewer trunk from Hawthorne Crest to the county treatment plant." I asked whether it was legal. She went quiet, and when an engineer goes quiet, you are not to fill the silence. She called again an hour later. There was an easement signed by my father in 1991, back when a developer planned 20 houses and went bankrupt before pouring the first foundation. The easement allowed a sewer line across our land for 32 years, but only if the holder inspected it annually, sent reports to the landowner, and paid a yearly access fee. Missed 3 consecutive years, and the right expired automatically at the end of the term. The term had ended 4 months earlier. There were no reports, no payments, no notices, nothing. Elise said, "Dad, as of today, that pipe is an unauthorized structure on your property." I sat at the kitchen table staring at Vivian's latest complaint about the smell from my mother's compost pile, while thousands of gallons of her community's waste moved silently beneath our crops. Then I called my attorney, Margaret Hale, and drove into town. She read the easement twice, removed her glasses, and said, "Caleb, you can legally shut it down after 90 days' notice." I asked what would happen if I did. Margaret folded her hands and looked at me the way doctors look at people before giving bad news. "Without your downhill line, the system backs up into the lowest structure in Hawthorne Crest." I asked which structure that was. She said, "Their clubhouse basement." So I leaned back, thought about every letter Vivian had ever sent my family, and said, "Send the notice." Vivian Cross received the notice at 9:15 on a Friday morning, and by lunch she had already called it extortion, sabotage, and an attack on 46 innocent families, which was impressive considering the letter was only 4 pages long and used none of those words. A process server handed it to her on the front steps of her house, and according to him, she read the first paragraph, looked toward my farm below the ridge, then said he has no idea who he is dealing with. By 3 that afternoon, Hawthorne Crest had filed for an emergency restraining order to stop me from touching the line. Vivian claimed the sewer had operated openly and peacefully for 17 years, that the community had relied on it in good faith, and that shutting it down would create a public health disaster. Margaret read the filing across from me in her office, raised one eyebrow, and said, "They are arguing that the emergency exists because they ignored the contract long enough to become dependent on breaking it." I asked whether that argument worked often. She said more often than it should, but not today. The judge denied the request before the courthouse closed. His order was short, almost painfully so. The HOA had been given decades to satisfy the written conditions of the easement, had failed to do so, and could not turn its own neglect into permanent rights over someone else's land. I thought that might bring Vivian to the table. Instead, she hired a large Charleston law firm, called an emergency board meeting, and told the residents I was trying to hold their homes hostage because I hated successful people. That part almost made me laugh. My combine cost more than her imported SUV. But apparently mud on your boots makes people assume you have never seen a bank statement. Over the next 6 weeks, her attorneys filed 3 more motions. One argued that the annual payments were symbolic. Another claimed my father had intended the easement to last forever. The third suggested the sewer line had become essential public infrastructure and therefore could not be removed, even if the private agreement supporting it had expired. Margaret defeated each one with the same document, the easement itself, signed, dated, recorded, and painfully clear. While Vivian burned through legal fees, I was doing the work she should have started on day one. I brought in an old college friend named Thomas Reed, now a senior engineer with a firm that designed rural water systems. He walked the entire route across my property, marked the access points, and found a buried control vault near the southern fence line that I had driven over for years without knowing what it was. He knelt beside the open hatch, studied the pumps, then looked up at me and said, "Caleb, this is the choke point. Shut these down, seal the line, and nothing from that ridge reaches the treatment plant." I asked how long before the backup began. He said somewhere between 36 and 60 hours, depending on household use. The first overflow would likely appear in the Hawthorne Crest clubhouse basement, then the pool equipment room, then the maintenance corridor beneath the central courtyard. I remember looking across the field at the ridge, those roofs catching the evening sun, and feeling no satisfaction at all. Anger is easy when consequences are abstract. It gets harder when you can picture somebody's grandkids at a birthday party in the building that might soon fill with sewage. So I did everything carefully. We filed engineering plans, notified the county, contacted the environmental office, documented the expired easement, and scheduled the disconnection for the 91st day. The state reviewed our plan and confirmed in writing that I was exercising a lawful property right, not causing an illegal discharge. Any backup would be the HOA's responsibility because they had continued operating without valid access. Vivian was copied on every document. She answered none of them. Instead, on day 48, she pushed through a $20,000 special assessment per household to finance more litigation. 26 homeowners voted yes, 20 voted no. Not $1 was assigned to building a replacement sewer route. On day 61, 4 of the residents who had voted against her drove down to my farm. They arrived in one gray SUV and stood on the porch looking like people who had not slept properly in weeks. Their spokesman was a retired Coast Guard engineer named Daniel Porter, a quiet man in his late 60s who had spent most of his career planning for disasters before they happened. With him were a former judge, a retired accountant, and a pediatric surgeon named Ruth Callahan. Nora brought out coffee, and Daniel said, "Mr. Mercer, we believe our board president has led us into a crisis she does not understand. Is there any way to stop the shutdown?" I told him the easement was finished and the old line would be disconnected, but I would consider a 30-day extension under 3 conditions. Vivian had to be removed. Construction on a replacement route had to begin within 7 days, and the HOA had to acknowledge the expired easement and repay the unpaid access fees. Daniel did not argue. He only nodded and said, "That is more reasonable than what we have been told." 4 days later, Hawthorne Crest held another emergency meeting. Vivian stood at the front of the clubhouse calling me vindictive, dangerous, and obsessed with humiliating her. Then Daniel placed the easement, the court orders, the engineering timeline, and the legal bills on a table in front of the residence. She was removed by a vote of 32 to 14. Daniel became interim president that same night, accepted my conditions the next morning, and had survey crews on the ridge before the week was over. For the first time, it looked like the disaster might be avoided, until the drilling crew hit a wall of limestone so dense their equipment advanced less than 10 feet a day. The completion date slipped past my extension by 16 days. Daniel called me on day 86, his voice tired but steady, and said, "Caleb, we are not going to make it." I looked at the calendar, then at the sealed engineering orders on my desk, and understood that the hardest decision had finally arrived. I told Daniel the extension would end on day 121, exactly as written, and for a few seconds neither of us said anything. Then he exhaled and said, "I understand. Give me the remaining time, and I will prepare them for what is coming." That was the difference between him and Vivian. She treated every deadline like an insult to her authority. Daniel treated it like weather, something you respected whether you liked it or not. He brought in portable sanitation units, hired tanker trucks, cleared the clubhouse basement, moved the electrical equipment upstairs, sealed interior doors, arranged hotel rooms for elderly residents, and held meetings twice a day so nobody had to depend on rumors. On the morning of day 121, Thomas arrived at my farm with an excavator, 2 county inspectors, and a crew carrying enough paperwork to make Margaret smile. My wife stood beside me near the control vault. My mother watched from the passenger seat of her old Buick, and Daniel came down from the ridge wearing work boots and a navy coat. At 1:58 in the afternoon, Thomas shut off the final pump, sealed both ends of the line, and signed the inspection sheet. Daniel shook my hand and said, "Caleb, I want you to know something. The clock that destroyed us was not the one you started 90 days ago. It was the 32-year clock our board ignored. The first sewage surfaced 47 hours later through a maintenance drain in the clubhouse basement. By Sunday morning, it was 6 inches deep. By Monday, it had reached the lower walls, and by Tuesday, the pool equipment room had started taking water. The smell rolled across the courtyard so heavily that one resident described it as if every bad decision the HOA had ever made had become airborne. I should admit, that line made me laugh, though not for long. Watching people pay for a disaster they did not personally create does not feel like victory, even when you were legally right. But Daniel's preparation worked. No homes were permanently damaged, nobody was harmed, and tanker trucks hauled waste to the county plant twice a day. 16 days later, the replacement line finally broke through the limestone and connected to the main system. The sewage began draining that same morning. The cleanup took weeks and cost Hawthorne Crest nearly $1.5 million, and their insurance carrier refused to cover it because the failure had been foreseeable. Vivian's story ended less gracefully. Investigators discovered she had signed annual reports claiming the HOA's easements were compliant when no inspections, payments, or landowner notices had been completed. She lost her real estate license, paid restitution, and served time for filing false corporate records. Daniel was later elected president without opposition. He cut the dues, created an annual easement audit, rebuilt the reserve fund, and personally delivered a written apology to my mother, who invited him inside for coffee and kept him there for nearly 2 hours. A year later, I stood in the restored Hawthorne Crest clubhouse, directly above the basement that had filled with sewage, and told the residents I did not blame 46 families for the decisions of one woman. I said our children would still share that valley long after we were gone, and revenge made a poor foundation for neighbors. They applauded. Daniel handed me a glass of bourbon, and outside the windows the evening sun settled over my soybean field as if nothing had happened beneath it. I still wonder, though, whether I did the right thing by refusing those final 16 days. The law says I did, my family says I did, even Daniel says I did. But law, mercy, and responsibility do not always arrive at the same answer. What would you have done? Extended the deadline again, or shut the line down exactly as promised? Tell me who you believe was truly responsible. Caleb, Vivian, the HOA board, or the residents who stayed silent too long. Share your opinion in the comments. And if you believe power should always come with accountability, subscribe and join us for the next story.